A question I often get asked is, do you have an army? And apart from 1,000 points of Iron Jaws and some Death Guard that I never quite got around to finishing, the answer is no. And the main reason for this is that I haven't played a game of Warhammer since the first edition of Age of Sigmar. By only having the loosest intentions to play a game, I never had the drive to actually build a full army. But after a little convincing by Byron from Facehammer, I will now be attending a 2,000 point grand tournament for Age of Sigmar. The problem is, I don't have an army. So I needed to pick one, and because I'm physically incapable of building Warhammer without kitbashing it in some way, I needed to choose something that would be fairly easy to convert on a large scale. And so I settled on Sylvaneth, well, a Nurgle-infected variant of them. It's not exactly an original idea. Casey from eBay Miniature Rescues had done a great job of some before, as have others, and Kirioth has even done some fantastic undead-themed Sylvaneth. But simply, they are just ripe for conversions. In this, and hopefully a number of subsequent videos, I will be detailing the construction and painting of my army over the several weeks before the tournament. I'll be giving this conversion 3 dead animal bits out of 5. There is a little sculpting work, but not too many additional components are required. I decided to begin my army with the rank and file, 25 Tree Revenants. I planned on including 15 of these guys in my list, with another 10 waiting to be summoned in by a L'Oreal, and I would be converting and painting these in a single batch. Starting off by removing each of the legs and torsos from their sprue and removing their mold lines as I did so. Once each of these had been removed and cleaned up, I assembled them until I was left with a series of torsos and leg pieces that looked like these. My next task was to graft on a few bloated stomachs from the Plaguebearer kit. I started off this process by first clipping away the lower part of a Plaguebearer abdomen, cutting in diagonally from each side and then directly across to retain a slightly rounded shape. I then compared this against my Tree Revenant to give me an idea of what needed to be cut in order for the stomach to fit. The necessary trims were then performed, making frequent comparisons to ensure that I wasn't making more cuts than were actually necessary. Once I was happy with how the stomach was fitting, I then glued this into place and repeated the same steps across a few more of my torsos. However, these stomachs just looked tacked on. They needed to be blended into the rest of the miniature, and the easiest way to do this was with green stuff. I began cutting equal amounts of blue and yellow and thoroughly mixed them together. Once done, I then applied small lumps of this putty around the edge of the stomach. These were then smoothed out and blended together. I used a sculpting tool here for this, along with plenty of Vaseline. You can use water here instead, as both will work to prevent the green stuff from sticking to your tools and your fingers. In addition to just blending the Plaguebearer stomachs, I also added some sagging folds of skin, which just helped to build up that corrupted appearance. The only problem with using Plaguebearer stomachs is that getting enough of them to fill out all of the 25 Tree Revenants that I was building would have been prohibitively expensive. So for the majority of my Revenants, I actually decided to sculpt my own distended stomachs. These were created by applying a ball of green stuff to the torso before blending the edges into the plastic part of the mini. Like before, I pressed in a series of folds and stretched the putty into bulging organic shapes, essentially mimicking the Plaguebearer torso to the best of my ability. For a few of these stomachs, just to add a little variation, I also took other parts from the Plaguebearer kit, such as parts of their arms and mouths. This just involved a little trimming, like with this skull here, before the part was pressed into the green stuff and the putty was spread around it to help it look more integrated. After repeating these steps across all 25 torsos, I was left with the following. You can see that while they all follow a similar style, by mixing together green stuff and Plaguebearer parts, I was able to create a unique looking appearance for each of the Revenants. These were all left to cure fully before I continued building out the rest of the models. The first of these were the weapons, and for the most part, these were simply built and attached as per the instructions, with no modifications being made to the swords and claws wielded by the rank and file. For the banner bearers and musicians, however, I wanted something a little more unique. The banners were fairly straightforward. I saw some Nurgle icons from various sources, such as the Putrid Blight King shields, but also the Plaguebearer banner bearers as well. These icons were trimmed down so they could fit nicely against the top part of the Sylvaneth banners. These helped to firmly cement these units as being under the corruption of Nurgle, rather than just being zombified undead. Similarly, for the musicians, I also wanted something suitably Nurgly, and what better way to do that than by using bells. These are present in many Nurgle kits from both Age of Sigmar and 40k, with this part in particular being taken from the Putrid Blight Kings. I clipped away the large bell along with part of the pole from its arm, and with a little trimming, I was able to glue the pole onto the torso of one of the Revenants, with it being supported by the branches behind. I continued these modifications across the other musicians as well, using a mixture of Death Guard bells, Plaguebearer instruments, and a modified Tree Revenant pipe. Once every Revenant had been equipped and armed, I could work on the heads. For these, I chose to use the human skulls from the Citadel's skull set. These were the perfect size and fitted into the necks of the Revenants perfectly without the need to adjust. I specifically chose the more broken and damaged looking heads for this, as it just helped to that decaying appearance. To help the unit leaders to stand out a little bit more, I opted to furnish these with some of the Plaguebearer skulls from the skull kit instead. These required a little extra cutting to the neck joints to help them fit, but provided a much easier way to identify my leaders at a glance, whilst also keeping them on theme. My final modification to the Tree Revenants was not only an aesthetic one, but it was also practical. I intended on running my Revenants as 3 units of 5 with a 10-man unit being summoned in by Ilariel. To make it easier to differentiate where one unit began and the other ended, I opted to add small details that would be unique to each unit. One unit was adorned with Nurglings hanging off their branches, another featured small bells, with the final 5-man unit featuring severed heads. The 10-man unit was left without these details, and so would be nicely distinguishable. And with those changes, I just needed to add some paint. I opted to paint all of my models in a single batch. This would help to cut down on changing out my colours for each step and give plenty of drying time between each layer. I also opted to use an airbrush for the first few of my steps, just to help speed up the process a little. The first step in painting the Nurgle was that ever important primer step. I wanted my Nurgle to be dark and foreboding, so a similarly dark primer was required. I chose to use some of Pro-Acryl's black-brown primer for this. Its dark brown colour is perfect for creating that starting colour of the wood. I used this through my airbrush and didn't need to use much in the way of thinner to get it to the right consistency, using about 30 psi and a 0.4mm nozzle. I quickly primed up my Tree Revenants, making sure to get the paint until all of those nooks and crannies around the branches. Once this was done, I not only had a much better surface to apply my paint to, but I also had the perfect starting colour. I should also mention that for all the paints that I'll be using from now on are also from the Pro-Acryl range. Quite a few of you recommended them to me after giving them a go. I've really enjoyed them. Still using my airbrush, I then turned my attention to the pale flesh of the Revenants. I wanted to finish on the pale tone of olive flesh, but didn't want such a strong step between this and the primer coat. So I opted to create a mixture of the regular black-brown paint and the olive flesh in a roughly 50-50 mixture. I also added in a few drops of flow improver just to help things through the nozzle. This mixture was then lightly applied over any areas of skin. This not only included the torsos, right arms and heads, but also the severed head, trophies and Nurglings that I had littered about. I didn't worry about getting complete coverage here. I just wanted the main surfaces to be picked out with this light brown mixture and wasn't too concerned about hitting those deeper recesses, as these would just appear as shadows. Continuing with the flesh, I next applied some pure olive flesh through my airbrush. This time I focused my application from slightly above. This caused the paint to mainly fall on the upper areas where light would fall naturally. This helped to create more depth in the model and benefited greatly from that intermediate shade that I'd applied in the last step. Inevitably, the airbrushing had spilled a little onto some of the wooden areas of the model. To bring these back to that dark brown colour, I next applied some black brown using a regular brush. I thinned this out with some water to help improve the flow, but the high pigmentation of the paint meant that I didn't lose out on coverage by doing so. This was applied to the areas around the flesh as well as the weapons, bringing them all back to that darker shade. Another way to save time in painting such a large number of models, especially ones with strong detailing like these, is with dry brushing. Dry brushing involves taking some paint, light umber in this case, and dipping in a large rounded brush like the one I'm using here. I use a tissue to help wipe away the excess paint and work the paint through the bristles. Once done, by using a series of quick but light strokes over the model, I quickly built up the paint over the raised edges. Keeping the brush very slightly damp here will also help to create a smoother application and avoid that dusty texture. This application was focused onto the wooden parts of the model, the lighter tone helping to bring out those surface details. Using an even lighter paint and the same dry brushing technique as before, I then focused this paint onto some of the more prominent details like the very tips of the branches, which created a smooth transition from dark to medium and then to a light brown. With my basic colours to the main bulk of the models achieved, I could begin to add a little colour variation. I added some transparent green to my airbrush and mixed in a little thinner to reduce its strength. This paint is similar to a wash but is much more highly pigmented, so when it is very lightly sprayed onto the recessed and lower areas of the model, it creates a greenish hue. This works well for both the Sylvaneth and Nurgle aspects of the model and helps to give both the flesh and the wood a slightly decaying appearance. The next step was to tackle the weapons. I wanted these to have strong, vibrant colour that would contrast against the duller tones of the rest of the model. I chose bright yellow-green for this task and would use my airbrush once again. However, to prevent the airbrush from overspraying onto the already painted parts of the model, I cut up some old vinyl gloves, but any plastic bag can work for this. The blade was then pressed through the surface so that a seal was created at the base of the blade. This allowed me to spray on a series of transitions onto the blade's edges without the risk of overspill onto other parts of the model. Just give the paint a chance to dry before removing the vinyl. Now that I had created the transitions on the blades, I could work on highlighting just the edges of the weapons with the same bright yellow-green as before. This just helps to accentuate the detailing in these areas and gives the blade a much sharper appearance. Similarly, I also used this paint over the leaves and small trinkets that dangled from a few of the branches. I used water to thin out the paint here, much like I did with my earlier application of black-brown. By retaining a degree of transparency here, I was able to benefit from the highlights that I dry brushed earlier on. Using another transparent paint, this time transparent purple, I created a thin mixture on my palette by mixing in some airbrush thinner. When applied directly into the recessed areas of the fleshy parts of the model, it flowed into them to create not only stronger shadows, but also a sickly and bruised appearance. It was particularly effective when used over the exposed innards, as the strong purple hue contrasted nicely against the lurid green of the weapons. Following the wash, the skin was then given a quick edge highlight of olive flesh. Even though this is the same paint that I'd applied earlier, the tone was much more saturated as I hadn't run it through the airbrush, so the highlights were still readily visible. I then tackled some of the smaller details like the teeth that resided within some of the stomachs and also the Nurglings as well, and for these I used some yellow ochre to create the appearance of dark, rotting bone. The final painting step focused on the small amount of metal on the models. This was mainly the bells, and for these I wanted a heavily corroded bronze effect. To create that verdigris colouring, I started off with some turquoise, and using that dry brushing method from earlier, I stippled on the paint over the metal surfaces. In addition to this, I also used a regular brush and plenty of water to create a thin mixture that I could use to paint directly into a few of the recesses. This was then finished off with a dry brush of bronze. This built up mainly on the surfaces and left the turquoise visible only in the recessed areas, completing that corroded bronze effect and completing the miniatures. So let's take a look at my finished Nurgle Tree Revenants. And here we have the first few units of my Nurgle army. Converting and painting this many models at one time is something that I have never done before. It was certainly a bit of a challenge, especially trying to make every model look unique, but I'm extremely happy with the result. And the great thing about building everything in one go is that I can move straight onto my Kurnoth Hunters next. So if you enjoyed this video, please do let me know in the comments below. I have at least 3 more conversion guides planned to complete before the tournament, so make sure you subscribe to be kept up to date when those go live. I'll include some affiliate links below, which will include all the paints and kits used in this video. So if you're looking to try out some of these things for yourself while supporting me in the process, I would be extremely grateful. Speaking of which, let me just say a huge thank you to my ever generous Patreon supporters. Currently, my top supporters on Patreon are Gustagpanzer, Jonathan Hart, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Jeremy Kaup, Jesse Smith, Casper Strand, Lyconian Primarch, Merrick, Mr. Grimm, Nice OJ, Swedsman, Casper Lindberg, and Tim. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliates links, then it is the kind-hearted people such as yourselves that allow me to fund the equipment and kits required to build bigger kit bashes such as this. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.